Now I would like to make a number of remarks on the relation of mathematics and physics, which are a little more general. The first is that the mathematicians only are dealing with the structure of the reasoning, and they do not really care about what they're talking. They don't even need to know what they're talking about, or as they themselves say, or whether what they say is true. Now I explain that. If you state the axioms, you say such and such a so, and such a so, and such a so, what then? Then the logic can be carried out without knowing what the such and such words mean. That is, if the statements about the axioms are true, are carefully formulated and complete enough, it is not necessary for the man who's doing the reasoning to have any knowledge of the meaning of these words, and he'll be able to deduce in the same language new conclusions. If I use the word triangle in one of the axioms, there'd be some statement about triangles in the conclusion, whereas the man who's doing the reasoning might not know what the triangle is. But then I can read his thing back and say, oh, a triangle, well, that's just a three-sided what have you, that's a so-and-so. And so I know this new fact. Mathematicians also like to make their reasoning as general as possible. If you say, I have a three-dimensional space, the ordinary space, I want to talk about ordinary space. You know, you're in it, and you measure distances, and there are three numbers you need to tell where something is. You go breadth, width, and height. Three-dimensional space, and you begin to ask them about theorems. Then they say, now look, if you had a space of n dimensions, then here are the theorems. Well, I say, yeah, but I only want the case 3. Well, substitute n equals 3. And then it turns out that very many of the complicated theorems they have are much simpler because it happens to be a special case. Now, the physicist is always interested in the special case. He's never interested in the general case. He's talking about something. He's not talking abstractly about anything. He knows what he's talking about. He wants to discuss the gravity law. He doesn't want the arbitrary force case. He wants the gravity law. And so there's a certain amount of reducing, because the mathematicians have prepared these things for a wide range of problems, which is very useful. And later on, it always turns out that the poor physicist has to come back and says, excuse me, when you wanted to tell me about the 4 dimensions, to summarize, I would use the words of Jeans, who said that the great architect seems to be a mathematician. And for you who don't know mathematics, it's really quite difficult to get a real feeling across up to the beauty, or the deepest beauty of nature. C.P. Snow talked about 2 cultures. I really think that those 2 cultures are people who do and people who do not have had this, people who have had and people who have not had this experience of understanding mathematics well enough to appreciate nature once. It's too bad that it has to be mathematics, and that mathematics for some people is hard. When it's reputed, I don't know if it's true, that when one of the kings was trying to learn geometry from Euclid, he complained that it was difficult. And Euclid said that there's no royal road to geometry. And there's no royal road. It's not we cannot, as people who look at this thing as a physicist, cannot convert this thing to any other language. You have, if you want to discuss nature, to learn about nature and to appreciate nature, it's necessary to find out the language that she speaks in. She offers her information only in one form. We are not so unhumble as to say, demand that she change before we pay any attention. It seems to me that it's like all the intellectual arguments that you can make would not in any way, or very, very little, will communicate to deaf ears what music, the experience of music really is. And all the intellectual arguments in the world will not convince those of the other culture. The philosophers who tried to teach you by telling you qualitatively about this thing. Me, who's trying to describe it to you, but it's not getting across because it's impossible. We're talking to deaf ears.